by Paul Greenberg, who, if any of you know Jackie Goss, his greatest claim to fame is actually that he's a friend of Jackie's. But we have a writer here, and a writer whose work I admire enormously. It's a wonderful book that he's written titled For Fish, which he is going to tell you about, so I won't. But I think that for a lot of you who are interested in food and food systems and the ideas of eating local, one thing that we often forget about is eating local from our waters. And the truth is, here in Annandale, we can't eat from the Hudson River because all fisheries have been closed down. If you want to go stick a fishing pole in there and let a fish and eat it, you can go ahead and contaminate yourself, right? But the last of the fisheries in the Hudson, which was shad fishing, was shut down last year. I think I said this earlier. And the biggest reason for that being shut down is just overfishing. So this is something that Paul's going to talk about. And for those of you who are thinking about environmental issues, he did begin in college thinking about environmental issues in Russia in particular, but he has a wonderful wayward path, which I'm sure he will tell us about, from living in Russia to coming back to this country, writing a novel, and then writing nonfiction that is more in a journalistic vein. So I give you all the...
Thank you. So I'm going to kind of stand up here just so I have access to the computer and this PowerPoint. And I should warn you that I have several versions of this particular PowerPoint presentation, but I got here sort of last minute. I missed my train. So I had to drive up. So this PowerPoint is not queued up, so I might actually have a joke that doesn't fall on the right slide. So if that happens, I hope you'll forgive me. You know, it doesn't matter. So anyway, I generally like to sort of start out by asking, anybody here a fisherman of any kind? Ever gone fishing, like to fish? Okay. And anyone ever here in the audience consider themselves like a ridiculous, insane fisherman? I am. I didn't expect to find one here, but you know, there's an expression in Russian which goes "rybak rybaka vidится издалека," which means a fisherman can always spot another fisherman from far away. And I always like to know who the extreme fishermen are in the room, because if they are there, it's, you know, I have to kind of talk around that person. Anyway, though, just to kind of give a little background on sort of how this book came about. A lot of people, when they see the title, they say, "Why For Fish?" And there's a very kind of scientific answer, you know, that details my pathway through college and post-college and stuff. But then there's the truth, which is that it actually began as an anxiety attack. I had been writing for the New York Times for a few years, doing stuff about fish, and gotten a little bit more and more excitement about it, not necessarily about me, but in the early 2000s, there were a lot of papers that came out about sort of the end of fish, the end of the ocean, and I sort of rode that wave a little bit, and at a certain point, my agent said, "Hey, let's submit a book proposal to the publishers." And previously, I'd written a very small, sad literary novel, which, you know, who here wants to write a small, sad literary novel, right? You know, everyone, or a great big literary novel. Well, so I wrote the small literary novel, and you know, it got published and everything, but it was small and sad. And so when I went out with this book proposal, I was kind of expecting another sort of small, sad experience. But because there was all this excitement, and you'll see, you know, if you go into environmental studies, certain things become big for no apparent reason. You know, the rediscovery of the ivory-billed woodpecker, which Michael knows all about in the back, you know, suddenly sucked all this money out of the Endangered Species Act, and it turned out probably not to have actually existed, this rediscovered ivory-billed woodpecker. So I happened to have gotten lucky on this fish thing. And suddenly there was like kind of like a bidding war, and people were really excited. And even this woman who had passed on my small literary novel, she actually put in a bid to my agent, and my agent said, "Courtney, we're way past that now." So that was like this sort of personal victory, and it was really great. So, but then, so, you know, and the book proposal was put out there as The Fish on Your Plate. It was this very broad, vague proposal, which if you ever write book proposals, make sure they're very, very broad and vague so that you can do whatever you want when you basically sit down to actually write the book. But in any case, I wrote the book proposal. There was bidding war. We sold it for a decent amount of money. And then the next morning, I was like, oh my God, I have to write this book. Which imagine, like, I don't know how long term papers are now, but like, 5, 10, 20 pages. Imagine you suddenly have a 300-page term paper due in about a year. So I was like, huge panic. So I started to think, well, how could I break this down a little bit? How could I, make this a more manageable book? And so I started looking around, and I looked at sort of examples in literature out there. And first thing I turned to were sort of big oceanography books, and I came across this sort of irritating statistic, which is that the taxonomic order Perciformes, the order from which we eat the most, is the most species-rich order of vertebrates on the planet. There's 7,000 species within the order Perciformes. And so I was like, great, I'm going to have to write a book called 7,000 Fish, which if I had, I think nothing really would have come of it. So then I thought about, well, could we pare this down somehow? And I started looking for models out there that had worked. And I turned to Michael Pollan. Who have you guys read Michael Pollan's Omnivore's Dilemma, Botany of Desire? Great books. And what Michael does is he breaks things down into 4s, right? Botany of Desire, he did 4 plants. I think it was potatoes, tulips, marijuana, and apples. And then in Omnivore's Dilemma, he did 4 meals. And so I thought, well, it worked for Michael. So maybe it would work for me. But, of course, there's kind of a fine line between, homage and outright plagiarism. So I had to kind of figure out a way to approach this in a way that would kind of be real. So I did a little more research. And I came across a book called History of the Domestication of Mammals. And it was written by an Oxford professor. And in it, she talked about how if you go back 10,000 years ago to the dawn of the domestication of animals, just before we started domesticating land animals, and you looked in the fire pits of Neolithic humans, you would find 30, 40, 50 different species in that fire pits. You would see elk, moose, chickens, rabbits, goats, anything. If it had meat on it and we could catch it, we tended to eat it. But if you telescope ahead about 8,000 years to the age of Christ, and you look in the fire pits then, and you look at the mammals that are in them, what do you see? Well, you basically see 4, right? Cattle, goats, sheep, pigs, right? So I started to think, well, okay, that's something there. And I started to wonder, does that apply to other areas of the things that we eat? And I happen to have had a meeting scheduled with Mark Kurlansky. Has anybody ever read Mark Kurlansky's book, Cod or Salt? I highly recommend, very, very good author. And Mark at the time was working on this big book about New York oysters, and he had like this sort of ideal writer's office that I wanted to have. Like if you guys are environmentalists and you want to be an environmental writer, don't you kind of imagine like a big stuffed leather armchair with like lithographs of old ships and things like that? So it's like he had it. He had done it. He'd written a bunch of bestsellers, and so he was really my model. But at the time, so he was working on this book about oysters, and he had been going through menus from 19th century New York, from New York City. And he said, look at all the birds on this menu. Snipe, woodcock, grouse, 4 or 5 different kinds of ducks, all these different things. And then, again, you telescope forward to the age of modern animal husbandry, to the 1940s and 50s, and what do we got? Turkeys, ducks, geese, chicken. The occasional pigeon, yes. Cornish game hen, I'm not even sure what that is. But suffice it to say that there seems to be this natural paring down of creatures that we seem to do. So there was that. That was sort of leading me in a kind of positive direction. And then I started to think, well, what about, where are we with fish? So I read a report in the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization does an annual report called The Status of World Fisheries and Aquaculture. And it would say if any of you guys, anybody here actually going to write about fish at any point in your final papers, or anybody interested in it at all? Well, if you do, someday down the line, what class or what year are they?
They're from first year to seniors.
Oh, okay. So if you do decide you want to go down the fish route at all, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization puts out this big report called The Status of World Fisheries and Aquaculture. And it's a kind of a dense report, but it's useful. Like, it's a really good starting off point to find out, like, well, what's the status of world fisheries and aquaculture? So I looked in this report, and right there in the first paragraph, it said aquaculture is the fastest growing, fish farming is the fastest growing form of food production on Earth, and that in the next 10 years, farmed seafood will exceed wild seafood in the marketplace. And this struck me as, wow, that's kind of big. I mean, and when you think about it, something like this hasn't happened in 10,000 years since we came out of the caves and started domesticating creatures. So I thought, well, that's something that's starting to hook up a little bit. And the other thing that I started to do, does anybody here, since this is not the fishiest crowd I've come across, but does anybody here ever go to a fish market and just kind of look at what's sort of on the ice there? Right, it's interesting. You actually, whereas when you go to a butcher shop, you see all these different kinds of cuts of meat that are basically more or less from the same 4 animals. You go to a fish market and you see this amazing proliferation of the life of the sea. But what I found is that, increasingly, and this is going to be my first probably lapsed PowerPoint joke, but what I found as I advanced, as I looked through different fish markets, I was finding more and more this. When I went to a fish market, this was what I saw, that while there were, as I said, 7,000 species in the order Perciformes alone from which we eat, and while there were those many creatures still represented, there was this kind of 4-note leitmotif that started to emerge in all the fish markets I went, no matter where I was in the world. So, and you think about it, it's also true in fish restaurants. If you go to a fish restaurant or you go to a fish market, you've got these sort of consumer expectations. You always want to have something pink and succulent. That would be your salmon that you would bake or you would maybe, smoke. It has high oil content. You'd like to have something white and flaky. That would be your cod, typically, but now increasingly, as I'll describe later in the talk, might be other things. And that's, you would deep fry or, make into fish nuggets or whatever. You'd like to have something a little more substantial and white and steaky, and that would be your sea bass. And as I'll explain later, if you thought the order Perciformes was complex, the things that are called bass or sea bass, turns out that I've found 8 taxonomic families that have creatures in them in which in the English language we call them bass. So it's a tremendous evolutionary elision that happens in the marketplace. And finally, we'd like to see something red and steaky, which is, increasingly since the last 40 years, the rise of sushi has made tuna this sort of increasingly large part of our palate. I remember when I was working in Moscow, one of my first jobs out of college was training journalists just after the Soviet Union fell. And I knew there was something happening with the sea when you drove down Tverskoy Boulevard and you noticed that there were like 5 sushi restaurants, in 4 blocks. Like, what were sushi restaurants doing in Moscow, one of the more landlocked places on Earth? So a real change. So there I had it, half of the seafood that we eat being domesticated, these 4 what I call flesh archetypes, a general tendency of humankind to try and kind of purify what we eat, and a little bit of a budget to go around the world and figure out if my thesis was true, which is what I did for the next year. I actually got a 2-year extension, so it turned out to be a 2-year project instead of a 1-year project. So the first fish I looked at was salmon. And I'm only showing 4 species here. I think there are a total of 7 altogether. But here on the East Coast, in the entire Atlantic Ocean, there's only 1 species of salmon. It's the Atlantic salmon. And then these 3 others are on the Pacific. But salmon, to me, represents sort of the original break that we made with nature, with fish that were in our neighborhood, with the fish next door. Once upon a time, salmon was a local staple on the East Coast. Anybody, there's a young crowd, but if you're in your 40s and Jewish like myself, you became acquainted with the idea like Nova lox. You always heard this phrase, oh, would you like some Nova lox? Well, that was Nova Scotia lox. And what is lox? Lox actually is from lox, the Norwegian for salmon. So once upon a time, Nova Scotia lox was wild Nova Scotia salmon from Nova Scotia. And that range of salmon extended from Nova Scotia, actually further up from Labrador, all the way south to the Connecticut River, which is salmon's most southerly range at one point. And these were very, very productive salmon runs. What happened to them? Well, I hope I have this right side. So this is a map of my home state of Connecticut. And every single point on this map is a dam. There are something like 3,500 to 4,000 dams in the state of Connecticut alone. And I often say that this is why people in Connecticut are so uptight, is their chi is blocked. If we could only unblock Connecticut, oh my God, it would be great. But, and I remember I was talking about this during a lecture in North Carolina, and afterwards this guy from Park Service in North Carolina sidled up to me. He says, y'all shouldn't be so tough on Connecticut, right? Because North Carolina, we have 35,000 dams. So this spree of dam building that happened over the last 400 years in this country is one of the largest ecological changes that you can imagine. And as Susan was mentioning, shad runs are another example. I mean, the Hudson doesn't really have, I guess, it doesn't have main stem dams, does it? Except further up? Troy Dam is the first one. But many, many rivers were lopped off and cut off from the ocean. And it's this flow of energy between the ocean and the fresh water that really made a lot of inshore fishing and commercial inshore fishing possible. And the funny thing is that all these little dams that appeared for all sorts of random and what we would say now ridiculous reasons. Some dams were made for ice ponds. Right, once upon a time there was not any refrigeration. So if you wanted ice for the summer, you would dam a little stream, make a pond, freeze the ice, cover it, bury it in the ground or cover it with hay, and you'd have ice for the year. Well, one guy does that, that's okay, but when you have 3,500 people do that throughout the state, you're going to start lopping off salmon runs left and right. Salmon are born in rivers, they migrate out into the ocean, they can come back as adults to spawn, and then the whole cycle begins again. But what happened is tributary after tributary got lopped off, and then eventually what happened is that big main stem dams started happening. And then at a certain point, a dam was put over the Connecticut River in 1798 at Turner's Falls. And for 3 years, salmon came back and bumped up against the dam, bumped against it, and then that was it. And that was the end of salmon in Connecticut. So that kind of drama and that kind of story has appeared throughout the East Coast, and it's also appeared in Europe because salmon are transcontinental, or I should say transoceanic. Atlantic salmon spawn and breed on the eastern side of the Atlantic as well as the western. And they all converge in one little place off of Greenland to feed. Now this is important because while there were all these sort of environmental things that were affecting the lives of salmon, there was also an overfishing event that really doomed our local salmon. And that was just after World War II. Remember, World War II was a very devastating thing for land-based food systems, right? Years and years of war, destroying rice paddies in Asia, destroying wheat fields in Europe, left people really kind of desperate for food. And meanwhile, in Europe, and meanwhile in the ocean had been left relatively unscathed. I mean, I always think, like, if you looked at World War II from a fish's perspective, they would probably call it the Great Reprieve, because for 5 years or more, you wouldn't really want to run a fishing boat in the North Atlantic. You'd probably get torpedoed. So after the war, though, suddenly there was this built-up, pent-up hunger and a built-up supply. And what happened was a small group of Faroese fishermen, people from the Faroe Islands, found the little spot off of Greenland where every single Atlantic salmon, whether they're from Europe or from America, came to feed. And they fished it, and they fished it extremely hard. And so one by one, all these salmon runs started dropping off. And that's when we really start to see Nova Scotia lochs disappear. Well, at the same time, another thing happens that is critical to the story that I tell in the book, which is this is 4-Fish Juvenile Edition. And it's a little bit of a cheat, courtesy of the internet. But I grabbed a few different examples of juvenile fish. And what do you notice about the salmon? This thing, right? This is actually, anybody here ever eat a salmon egg? Like you ever go to sushi and have like the salmon eggs, the big red salmon eggs? Well, so that's unusual for fish. Most fish hatch out of little tiny eggs that are like microns across. But salmon, because they lay their eggs in the fall, the eggs have to overwinter and then they hatch in the spring. There's not a lot of food in the water, so the salmon, for the first few weeks of its life, lives off of the egg. And this little bulge is actually the remnants of the egg sac. So this turns out to make salmon really easy for aquaculture. Because they can live for the first few weeks of their lives off of this egg sac, they don't need to be fed. And then when they do need to be fed, you can feed them industrial feed pellets. So as wild salmon were going down, and this is like 50s, early 60s, people started trying to figure out, well, could you farm salmon? Could you farm them productively? And of course, my research met this guy named Trygve Gedrum, who was considered sort of the founder of modern fish breeding. And this was an interesting guy. He sort of like was this little old man in a little derby, and he had come to America on a Fulbright with the idea that he wanted to breed sheep. And he went to Iowa State University, and he met a guy named J. Lawrence Lush, who introduced him to the concept of population dynamics and population breeding. And what Lush told him was that you can actually move the productivity of an entire population of animals significantly in a few generations if you breed for efficient traits. Well, with sheep, with goats, with all sorts of land animals that only have like one offspring per litter, that can be somewhat slow. It takes a few generations to figure out where the good ones are and where the bad ones are. But what Trygve Gedrum realized was that, wow, if you could do that with salmon, I mean, salmon have 5 or 6,000 eggs per bunch. So what they did is back in Norway, is they selected from 40 different salmon rivers around the country and started selectively breeding. And within 10 years, they had doubled the growth rate for growing salmon and halved the amount of feed that you had to feed them. So it was this really tremendously incredible experiment. Now, so the Latin name for Atlantic salmon is Salmo salar, but what eventually ended up happening was that they ended up breeding a fish that is so different that some ecologists like to call Salmo salar Salmo domesticus, that in fact it represented a completely different species of salmon. Now, why was this a problem? Well, where do you farm salmon but in the places where wild salmon exist? And as I told you, there was already this sort of extirpation event that happened in Greenland. There were all these dams. Salmon were really, really diminished. And then lo and behold, people started plopping down nets full of farmed Salmo domesticus right in the middle of salmon runs, interrupting their passage into the sea with huge amounts of escapes, so that now that there's something like 1 million to 2 million farmed salmon escape every year. These concentrations, they're just like any animal feedlot. When you put a lot of animals in one place, you're going to get disease. Sea lice, this ectoparasite that burrows into the skin, particularly of juveniles, migrating juveniles, was a huge problem. So you had this kind of delete and replace thing going on with Atlantic salmon. The amount of salmon in the marketplace was going up and up, but the amount of salmon in the wild was going down and down. And the great sleight of hand that the industry did was they wouldn't even say it was farmed salmon. They would say it was Atlantic salmon. Now, if you go to, this is a useful kind of thing. I know a lot of people are confused about like farmed and wild, but if you go to the supermarket and you see Atlantic salmon listed, that is farmed. It's always farmed because Atlantic salmon are commercially extinct. Commercial extinction means basically there aren't enough of them out there to go fishing for them, to make it worthwhile to go fishing for them. Yeah, there are probably a couple of million wild Atlantic salmon left in the world, maybe more, but it's not enough to feed us. So that was what I call salmon delete and replace 1.0. We're now on to what I call salmon and delete and replace 2.0. So who here has heard about the genetically modified salmon that Aqua Bounty is doing? Just one person. Okay, well, it's something you should be aware of. So FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, has just given preliminary approval for a genetically modified salmon. And what that salmon is, it's the already twice as fast growing Atlantic salmon with a growth gene from the Pacific salmon, from the Pacific king salmon, modified or controlled by a regulator protein from this fish, the ocean pout, into a fish that grows twice as fast as the already twice as fast growing farmed Atlantic salmon. By the way, I checked this out with the rabbis. This is not a kosher fish. And I always wondered, like, well, does that make this not a kosher fish? And I had this long rabbinical discussion with one of the rabbis. And by the way, there's nobody really who decides within the rabbinate, what's kosher and what isn't. It's just a lot of people who argue. Because no, look, if it has scales, it has fins, it's kosher. But rabbi, what do we care about the internal aspects of the genetics? So, whatever. I was really trying to push the rabbi to go on the record as saying that it wasn't kosher, but he refused because I think generally the be fruitful and multiply trumps fins and scales or something. I don't know. It worked for them. There was actually a similar thing that had to do with rennet and cheese, by the way, because I think rennet might have come from an unkosher animal. I don't know. I don't do land food yet. Anyway, so this fish has just passed FDA, and we're now in the public comment period, which ends April 27th. So if you would like to publicly comment on this, now is the time. But if we were to replace all of our North American salmon farms with this fish, we would probably end up with about 200 million more pounds of salmon per year. Well, curiously, there's this other phenomenon going on, which is this is the Wood-Tick-Chick Reserve in Alaska at the headwaters of Bristol Bay. This is the most productive salmon fishery in America, possibly in the world. There's something like 40 to 60 million salmon, wild salmon, that migrate into the system every year. And I've spent a couple of times up here. It's just an amazingly beautiful place. You can just see, like, when you hear the stories of the rivers turning red, these are sockeye salmon. They're just everywhere. It's an amazing, amazing situation. But unfortunately, there's now a plan to put the continent's largest copper mine atop the largest salmon run in America. It's a copper and gold mine, and it's two companies, Anglo-American and Northern Dynasty, both foreign companies. The plan is to extract and process 10 billion tons of ore. 10 billion tons is basically a mile cubed. So it's a vast, vast area. It's right in the watershed where all these salmon spawn. EPA has done one assessment where they put forward that it's probably a very good likelihood that a mining failure would occur. And by the way, copper itself is bad for salmon. I think less than 2% of copper in the less than 2 parts per million. Don't quote me on the exact thing, so it's been a while since I looked at this data. But a very small percentage of copper in the water is enough to throw a salmon's navigation ability off. So you get a mining failure, you're going to have 40 to 60 million very lost salmon. If Pebble Mine goes through, that's 200 million less salmon in the world. If AquaBounty's genetically modified salmon goes through, that's 200 million more pounds of salmon. So while I don't think that there's a conspiracy between the Pebble Mine and AquaBounty, there is a human conspiracy, which is to remove wild randomness and replace with productive systems that serve us efficiently. And if you're involved in environmental studies, whatever you're studying, you're going to come up and bump up against this again and again and again, whether it's fish or meat or grain or water or whatever. It's something to keep your ears attuned to. So that was salmon. And then I moved on to my next fish as I got moved on. One thing I didn't say about salmon is that I kind of think of salmon as the sort of Chinese food delivery of fish. They swim up into our rivers. They're right there. They're right in our grasp. They swim to us. And so that's why a lot of native cultures have this very intimate relationship with these fish, because they really come to them and they seem divine sent. The next set of fish, though, is a little bit further down. So the fish that we generally call the basses, as I said, come from 8 different taxonomic families. They tend to inhabit the lower part of rivers. They tend to inhabit estuaries and then migrate to the near-offshore or to nearshore waters 2 or 3 miles off. But what we saw, particularly in the 80s, was a kind of delete and replace thing going on with bass as well. So this fish, the American striped bass, we actually have in the Hudson River. Anybody ever seen a striped bass or caught a striped bass? So this is a great fish, beautiful fish, one of my favorite fish, and used to be quite abundant, or is now again actually fairly abundant, but went into huge decline in the 70s and early 80s because of a combination of habitat degradation and overfishing. This fish, another American fish, people call it the channel bass in the Carolinas. They also call it redfish, which is important. In the 80s, a chef named Paul Prudhomme invented a dish called blackened redfish. Anybody ever hear of that? Or is that? Yeah. It's one of these things, food trends, they come and go. But he made up this dish called blackened redfish. And prior to that, redfish was just a good old boy fish. You just ate it locally, and that was if you were in the South. But suddenly everybody wanted blackened redfish, and this fish got just decimated. So then on the far west coast, there's another fish, which I didn't include in this slide. If I'm on the west coast, this fish gets swapped out with another bass called the California white sea bass, which again doesn't really have too much to do with these other fish. But that fish also went bust in the 80s because of overfishing, because of the birth of the hibachi. You know, if you're my age, you remember the 70s, your dad went out with this grill thing called the hibachi. And what you needed to grill a fish on the hibachi was a big chunk. And big chunks come from big fish. And the California white sea bass was one of these fish that was used for that. Well, anyway, all those 3 fish went bust in the 80s. But what should appear in 1983 for the first time, but this fish, the Chilean sea bass. Anybody ever eat a Chilean sea bass or see it on the menu? This fish it was formerly called the Patagonian toothfish, Dysosticus eleganoides. And I think it was called, in Russian, the Antarctichesky klikoch, which means Antarctic fangfish. So these were not market names. It didn't move. The product didn't move. In Spanish, they call it bacalao de profundidad, the cod of the deep, because by that point, cod had gone into serious decline, and they tried to slot in this fish as a replacement. The problem was this fish was very, very oily. It didn't really, you couldn't deep fry it. It was much more in the bass niche. But what people who did discover it were cruise lines. Cruise lines actually need a fish that can sit in a tray for a really long time on a propane stove. And this fish is called perfect fish because it never dries out. But in any case, then you started to see wide-ranging fleets going after this fish, going to the bottom of the world. It's mostly, as I said, it's Chilean sea bass, Patagonian toothfish. It's circumpolar all around the southern pole, and vast amounts of pirate fishing started for this fish, and it went into decline. And then finally, what happened was this fish showed up, the European sea bass. Anybody ever eat a branzino? Ever see that on a menu, or a loup de mer or something like that? Maybe your parents would, because they don't take you out to those nice restaurants. They're paying this tuition. How can they take you out to a place that has loup de mer? But the European sea bass was one of these fish that appeared out of nowhere, and nobody knew what it was, and nobody knew where it was coming from. But in fact, it actually is the farmed replacement for all 3 of these. But just as a sort of an aside, all of these fish, taxonomically, have about as much to do with each other as the ring-tailed lemur and my son, Luke Greenberg. They're still primates, right? But they are actually very, very different from one another. So, but to get back to the European sea bass, the European sea bass, as I say, was the sort of next real big challenge to domesticate. Remember I was talking about with salmon how they hatched out of those big red nutrient-rich eggs? Well, sea bass and most of the fish in the ocean hatch out of these really little tiny eggs. And when they're born, they need to immediately eat something. It's like they're desperate to eat something. How do you grow food, live food, for tons of, millions of little sea bass or whatever you want to grow? How do you do it? Nobody knew. So 2 things happened. The first was that in China, they'd been growing carp in ponds for a number of years. And there was a unicellular organism called a rotifer that tended to clog up their outtake valves. Somebody realized that you could take a rotifer and you could feed it lipids and fats and turn it into a kind of little vibrating ravioli. And it turned out that this was an excellent primary feed for juvenile marine fish. And it was this thing that really unlocked that first phase of life. But that wasn't quite enough. That will only get you a sea bass so big. So you have to go to another thing. And the next thing they turned to was something that, again, I'm dating myself, but perhaps you all know this. Anybody here order a sea monkey from the back of a comic book? I'm glad to see that somebody's still trying to pull off a scam on the younger generation. So sea monkeys are actually Artemia. They're brine shrimp. And I remember the first time I was introduced to them, I was doing a story about cod aquaculture in Norway. And I was looking at them through a microscope at them with a Norwegian scientist. And I said, so, where do you get these brine shrimp? And he goes, oh, we get them from the Great Salt Lake. And I said, really? I said, I didn't know that Norway had a Great Salt Lake. He said, no, your Great Salt Lake. And so it was interesting. Suddenly I realized, I don't know if you guys, but when I think of the Great Salt Lake, I think of this dead place, right? But it turns out that the Great Salt Lake and a few other places in the world are these engines for modern aquaculture, because they are places where these brine shrimp are born, where they then form these cysts that can last for thousands of years. And they're very, very mobile. You can put them in a packet. You could either send them to a teenager who thinks that they are a royal family, or you could send them to an aquaculture farm where they hope they'll be made into a royal family as a result of their aquaculture prowess. So the combination of these 2 things, of the rotifers that were rescued from the Chinese carp ponds and the sea monkeys, made this two-step process that allowed you to raise a microscopic little creature into big enough size so that you could then dump in the industrial feed pellets. And a little aside about the industrial feed pellets, there's now a huge industry for feeding fish. As I said, 50% of the world's fish are now farmed. What do they eat? Well, mostly other fish. In the early days of aquaculture, it could take as many as 6 pounds of wild fish to grow a single pound of salmon. The industry claims they've gotten that below 2, by using all sorts of things like genetically modified soybean, all these kinds of things, to come up with some sort of alternative feed. But generally, little fish, what are called forage fish, make up something like 20 to 30% of the world catch. That's like 20 to 30 million tons of fish a year that is ground up and fed to other fish. It's also fed to your cats. So I think something like 60% of these forage fish go to feed other fish in aquaculture farms. 10 to 15 to cows and to chickens, 10 to 15 to pigs, and about 10% to cats. On the chicken front, chickens also sometimes feather meal is ground up and fed to fish. And I always wonder, is there a fish out there that ate a chicken that ate a fish that ate, the possibilities spin out of control. But once you start delving into the weird integrated world of global food production, it's a very complicated, messy operation. So anyway, so that's the story of sea bass. But the important thing is that what sea bass did was to unlock the aquaculture secret for the entire world. So suddenly you could domesticate anything. Anything. Those 7,000 species that I spoke of in the order Perciformes, you could tame all of them. Should we tame all of them? Are there ones that work better as wild creatures, or are there some that work better on the farm? Nobody was really asking that question. And it's particularly relevant when you look at the sort of trend that you see in fish consumption. So this is just sort of world population and fish consumption. And what you can see is the marine catch goes up and up and up and up through these last post-war years. And basically, we've quintupled the world catch since around World War II to the present time. So to the point where we now take 80 to 90 million tons of fish from the sea every year. That's the equivalent of the human weight of China taken out of the sea every single year. And so you could say to yourself, on the one hand, wow, humans, what a bunch of environmental rapists that they're just destroying the ocean like this year after year. On the other hand, you could look at it and say, wow, ocean, 90 million tons every year. You keep producing that. How? So I throw the statistic out to both show the threat, but also to show that the oceans are still very much alive. When you hear about the end of the ocean, the end of this, the end of that, it's not there yet by a long shot. The ocean is still a very, very productive place. But you do see these rising trends. Per capita fish consumption has doubled. I think that's this green line. It's like it's going from here, right, to over there. So world population obviously is going up and up. We're going to be hit 9 billion people in your guys' lifetime. So how are we going to feed all these people, and how are we going to feed them fish? Well, that brings me to the next slide, which is if you want to see where white fish are going, and when you talk about cod, so this whole section is about cod, right? Just if you need it for your organizing notes. If you're talking about cod, you're talking about white fish, that thing that you turn into a fish nugget or a fish sandwich. And the best way you can kind of describe it is to look at that paragon of American cuisine, the Fillet fish sandwich, and see how it has changed over the last few years. So the Fillet fish sandwich was actually invented in a Cleveland franchise because on Fridays, the owner of the franchise noticed that nobody came in. Why? It was in a Catholic neighborhood. People ate fish on Fridays. So he decided to invent this fish sandwich. And I always imagine him having this conversation with Ray Kroc, the owner of McDonald's, and being like, Ray, hey Ray, I got this great idea for a sandwich. And Ray Kroc's like, what do you got? Well, so it's a fish sandwich. What, a fish sandwich? What are you making it out of? Well, so I got halibut. I got a halibut. Isn't that expensive? Well, no, it's not too bad. Ray, I used the offcuts. It's only 75 cents a sandwich. 75 cents. I can't sell a fish sandwich for 75 cents. I need a 25-cent sandwich. So he did. He made a 25-cent sandwich. And what it was made out of was Atlantic cod. And Atlantic cod was once upon a time like the working man's fish. Vast shoals of them used to exist off the Grand Banks of Canada, in the North Sea, in the Barents Sea. But as the sort of, McDonald's is not the only entity that destroyed cod. It was a gangbang of multiple different organizations that sort of came in and really saw this huge aggregation of fish. And it actually began as early as the 17th century, when triangular trade was first came about. Cod were dried and salted in Boston. They were then sent to the slave states where they fed slaves, and then indigo was harvested in return and sent over to industrialized Europe. And so this three-way system was very much dependent upon cod. So this system had been going on and on for years, but when suddenly cod was industrialized, when freezing was invented by Clarence Birdseye, when fish and chips were invented, when fish sticks were invented, suddenly cod went from being a handline caught fish to a trawled fish, where these huge, huge super trawlers that are able to just totally level a piece of bottom ground in minutes were invented to really hit this fish really hard. So what happens is, so the Fillet-O-Fish sandwich was cod for a number of years, and then it gets to about 94. And the cod really don't hold out anymore. So what is the Fillet-O-Fish sandwich now? It's this fish, the Alaska pollock. Anybody here ever knowingly eat an Alaska pollock? Probably not, but have you ever eaten who's eaten a California roll in the sushi, right? So you ate Alaska pollock. That fake crab, Larry David has this whole routine about fake crab versus real crab. Well, the fake crab is the Alaska pollock, and it's through an industrial process made into this thing that looks like crab, but it's also made into the Fillet-O-Fish sandwich. A lot of people out there, in the Alaska pollock has been certified by the Marine Stewardship Council, which is this big nonprofit that certifies fish as being sustainable or not, has certified it being sustainable. And we catch about 3 billion pounds of Alaska pollock every year. They claim that there are 60 billion pounds of pollock out there, and that we're only taking 3 billion pounds. But I always have to ask myself, what natural system can suffer the removal of 3 billion pounds of biomass every year? Maybe this system can. One of the sort of my pet theories that I've never been able to prove is that what we've done in the last 100 years is adjust the food chain so that the fish that normally went to marine mammals, seals, killer whales, dolphins, we now eat. And we've reduced marine mammals to such a point that we've basically created a market for us, that we consume all these things. So again, macro, large systems, how does that work? Well, anyway, so Alaska pollock, there's been some controversy. Can this system hold out for 3 billion pounds every year? We don't know. And that's when this fish appeared, which is the Nile tilapia. And who here has ever eaten a tilapia? Yeah, you've all eaten tilapia. Well, so 15, 20 years ago, nobody knew what a tilapia was. There's an aquaculturist that I know, the first time he heard the word tilapia, he thought it was a stomach disease. And it could have been an association because of that, because tilapia were actually spread around the world by the Peace Corps. Peace Corps volunteers went to Africa, to Asia, and they found that there was this fish that you could throw into a pond. It would eat all the algae and turn into protein. So it was this amazing miracle fish. And a lot of these Peace Corps volunteers, when they quit the Peace Corps, realized, well, let's try and figure out a way to make this palatable. Because if you throw a tilapia into a muddy pond and it eats the algae, it gets this thing called off flavor. Have anyone ever had a muddy fish experience? It's sort of like, people associate with catfish a lot of times. But what it really comes from is from an algal bloom, a blue-green algal bloom, and it spreads this compound called geosmin, which gives fish this muddy taste. Well, they figured out with tilapia that if you fed it genetically modified soybeans and corn, all these kinds of things, that you could get it not to have that muddy taste, that it would have this pure whitefish taste that was, worked very well in a fish and chips situation. Now, so the Fillet-O-Fish is not made out of tilapia, but if you go to any other fast food restaurant, like I was in a Denny's the other day, the only fish on the menu was the tilapia. So again, there's a big ecological choice going forward. Do we, as a species, find these large aggregations of fish and hope that they'll hold out under our various metrics? Or do we find a super efficient fish like this and farm it, albeit with genetically modified soybeans? But these are big, this is a very big choice. And fish is the key protein in 2 to 3 billion people's lives. So when you think about what's the future of fish, that's the future of fish. Something to think about. There's one other fish which I just wanted to show you, which is the other super fast-growing fish. This is in Vietnam, where I was a few years ago. This is a farm. This is Pangasius catfish, and these fish are even more productive than the tilapia. When the ponds that they're grown in run out of air, these fish like stick their faces above the water and take a breath. They can breathe. So this might be the real face of fish to come. That's the Pangasius catfish. And you've probably also eaten this fish. This fish often appears on the menu as fish, right? Or if you've ever had the displeasure of a hospital visit and you ask, what's for lunch today? And they say, fish. That's probably what you're getting. Very, very cheap to grow. Nothing particularly wrong with it. It's just not, it's not a great beauty, but you do what you do. Anyway, this is the last fish. And in an academic environment, I always say, I always hear sort of a breath of relief when I bring in the last fish, because it's like, how in a class, the professor says, we're going to talk about 4 things today. And you're like, 1, 2, oh, it's the 4th. So we're at the 4th, and I'll be brief on the 4th. This fish that I want to discuss is tuna. And as you gathered from my beginning of my talk, I'm a big fisherman. I love to fish. And I used to love to fish for tuna. But this was really the point at which I started to think about fish not just as food, but as wildlife. All the tunas swim incredibly fast, in excess of 40 miles an hour. All of them migrate tremendously great distances. One fish in particular, I should say 3 fish in particular, the bluefin. This is an Atlantic bluefin. There are actually 3 species of bluefin. Everybody hear about bluefin tuna. Is it on your radar at all as a species of concern? So bluefin tuna, there are 3 species of bluefin. There's an Atlantic that crosses the Atlantic, goes from the Mediterranean to almost to the New York Bight. There's a Pacific species that goes from Japan to San Diego. And then there's a southern bluefin that circles the bottom of the world. All of these fish are these tremendously beautiful, charismatic animals. If you know, in wildlife circles, I don't know if you guys have been looking at endangered species issues, but a lot of times what will happen is a nonprofit will grab hold, an NGO will grab hold of an animal and call it charismatic megafauna as this way of preserving larger habitats. Nobody cares about the jungles of Java, but they care about a Javanese tiger, right? So you use that as your symbol to carry forward. And to some degree, great naturalists like Carl Safina and others have really taken this fish as an example of charismatic megafauna. This was actually on a really great organization. If I've sparked your interest in fish at all, and you're looking for a summer internship, and you can possibly convince what might be the meanest person in science to hire you, but possibly one of the greatest people in science to hire, this organization called Tag a Giant. Is just an amazing organization, and they catch these huge tuna, so you actually get to sit in the big fighting chair and reel the fish in, but then they bring them in the boat, tag them, put on satellite tags, and it's very wild kingdom, it's like very, tracking fish, and they've actually been able to establish the migratory routes of these bluefin tuna. But anyway, as the more time I spent with bluefin tuna, the more I came to realize that these were wildlife, They reach, a bluefin can be over 1,500 pounds, they swim at 40 miles an hour, they have a sextant-like organ in their head that allows them to track sunlight and navigate across the open ocean. This is something a lot of people don't know. They're warm-blooded. The big tunas are warm-blooded. They can heat their blood 20 degrees above ambient, and they do that so that they can hunt in the colder waters. They might travel in the warmer waters of the Gulf Stream, but oftentimes the best feeding is on what are called temperature breaks, edges between warm water and cold water, and they use that ability to both have high muscle functioning in cold water, but they also heat their eyes. And if you look at tuna eye, it has very big, very luminescent. And when a tuna comes out of the water, it's like nothing you've ever seen. We're used to seeing these gray slabs of skin with the red meat. But tuna fresh out of the water, you literally see the colors dancing and vanishing before your eyes. It's a really amazing thing. The only person I know who's ever really managed to capture it is my friend James Prozek. And this is a portrait he did of a live bluefin tuna. And just, he obviously had to freeze it in time, but all these patterns are pulsing and changing constantly, showing you that this is this incredible, incredible organism. So I thought I would end the sort of formal part of my talk just reading about the last time I went tuna fishing. This is a yellowfin tuna, which is maybe not as charismatic, but I still think of it all as a piece. But I thought I'd just read you a little bit from my book about the last time that I went tuna fishing. I was out, it was just after September 11th, and I'd actually been walking towards the towers when they fell. Well, actually, when they were hit. I had jury duty, and I kept walking in the direction of the courthouse, which was near the towers, and everyone was walking the other direction, and finally a cop saw me, and he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I got jury duty." And he said, "Jury dismissed." So I walked up, and I had actually made a tuna boat reservation before the September 11th happened. So I found myself out on this tuna boat out of Brooklyn, and it was kind of an amazing thing that you can go out of Brooklyn and catch a fish as big as a tiger, 6-hour steam from Brooklyn. Kind of amazing. So I was on this boat called the Explorer. I was fishing next to this guy named Steve, who had walked out of Tower 2. And after that, his wife told him he could go fishing whenever he wanted to. So I was fishing next to him on this boat called the Explorer. We're out in this place called the Canyon, or called the Hudson Canyon. There are all these deep water, there are about 70 deep water canyons from Cape Hatteras north to Canada, where they can be as much as 15,000 feet deep. The canyons draw in all this marine life. They intersect with the Gulf Stream, and they can be very rough. And I was out there on a very, very rough night. So I just thought I'd read this. I'm on board this fishing boat called the Explorer, out on rough seas in the middle of the night, with the first tuna of the night on my line. No, I can read fine. Like the fishing boat Explorer, tuna are all engine. On the line, they feel like no other fish, and one can almost imagine the Schwarzenegger-type muscles flexing and pulsing their myoglobin-rich tissue in coordinated, punishing synchronization. They are the one fish out there that makes a fisherman think, I don't know if I can do this. As the tuna sprinted off, I sank into a kind of a squat, trying to shift the stress from my back onto my knees. This in turn caused a problem. I'd worn extra wide pants to accommodate long underwear, but the weather was downright balmy out on the canyon, and I'd shed my long underwear before coming to the rails. Now as the tuna surged forward and I bent my knees in a defensive crouch, my baggy pants fell down to my knees. When I reached around to pull them back up, the tuna seems to sense it and swam even harder. My pants finally settled midway down my thighs. Steve came up behind me. "You don't look so good," he said. "I know. You want me to take that pole for you?" "No, I'm fine," I said. You don't have to feel ashamed," he said. "Tuna are tough." "I know!" 10 minutes into the fight, the tuna stopped swimming and I stopped reeling. Steve stood by my side and shook his head. "Jesus," he said. Then all at once it turned and charged the boat. "Hey, reel, buddy, reel, reel, reel," Steve shouted. I put my head down and cranked, trying to take up the slack. "Hey, Jesus, buddy, watch out," I heard Steve cry. I opened my eyes and saw that the hood strings of my sweatshirt were dangling in my reel. I was about to be bound Ahab-like to my fishing pole. Gingerly, Steve reached around my shoulders and tucked the sweatshirt strings into my collar. "Thanks, man," I said. "Doing good, buddy." The tuna began swimming a broad, slow arc around the boat. "It's the death spiral," Steve said solemnly. The death spiral's diameter decreased with each big circle. 3 more circles and I dared to peek over the rail. Way down, just below the glow of the boat's running lights, I saw a muted green flash. "Hey," Steve called out, "we got color here." A mate came by and looked down into the water. "All that screaming over that little thing," he said. The mate lowered the gaff. I held my breath. Sometimes when tuna see the shining metal hook coming at them, they streak off in a ridiculous last-ditch escape run, sometimes tail-walking across the water before busting the line. But the mate dipped down agilely and struck into the fish's flesh. He tried to lift it into the boat. "Jesus," he said. "Not so little?" I asked. "Not so little." The mate was yanked onto his tiptoes by the unseen force below. Steve thought fast and grabbed another gaff and struck. He and the mate swayed back and forth like a pair of girls doing the hula. Then they each exhaled, counted to 3, and raised their gaffs hands over fist in sync. The fish rolled over the rail, furious. Steve shook his gaff free and jumped back. The tuna hit the deck hard. It was a yellowfin tuna, and true to its name, its dozen-odd finlets running down the aft ridges of its torso glowed canary bright in the darkness. In spite of its hard fight, the fish was still angry and dangerous and as big as an adolescent. Its huge, superheated eye met mine, and we both gasped for air. If the tuna had had a voice and the power of reason, it would have screamed and pleaded at this point. But the only expressive thing about a tuna is its tail. All a tuna ever does its whole life is crank its tail back and forth with great determination, even after it's caught, after it's in the air. It never occurs to a tuna to switch off its relentless tuna motor. Bap, 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 bap. It goes until the mate cuts its throat and the blood pours out onto the deck. Bap, 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 bap. The engine runs down and then stops cold. Congrats, said Steve. Thanks, I said, and vomited. So that's that. So that's the talk. So I think what we're at right now is, we got 20 minutes left, and more or less, right? So if people want to talk more informally about the book or about fish or about anything or about your career paths or what you want to do with your lives as environmental students or anything, I'm happy to discuss it. So any questions? Yes?
I was wondering what you knew about aquaponics and if you think it's like a viable way.
Yeah. So what do I know about aquaponics and is it a viable way of doing it? So aquaponics is an integrated system where you basically use fish as fertilizer for plants. And there's a pretty good book out called Aquaponic Gardening. Actually, I'm going to take my jacket off. That came out, I think, a year or two ago. That's worth, if you're interested in looking into it, it's kind of cool. All of that stems from the very early days of aquaculture. Once upon a time, aquaculture was entirely polyspecies, polycyclical. And like the original, aquaculture is actually extremely old. The last 40 years, people tend to call it the Blue Revolution. There was the Green Revolution during the 60s and 70s, but the last really 20 years has been this Blue Revolution of figuring out all these species and how to domesticate them. But aquaculture really began in China, we're talking like 4,000 years ago. And the original systems that they did was they would have silk farms where mulberry bushes hung over ponds, and then the silkworm casings fell into the water. Carp ate the silkworm casings. They defecated into the water, which encouraged the growth of rice and other grasses, which fed ducks, but also people. So out of this system, 4 or 5 different creatures, useful creatures, were fed. And I think we all would like to see a more integrated system working like that. There are ideas of trying to be polycultural with modern day aquaculture. In my book, in the salmon chapter, you always try to end these chapters with the good example that could make people change everything. But this guy has developed a system called IMTA. It's called Integrated Multitrophic Aquaculture. And what he does there is they have salmon growing in these net cages. They defecate into the water, but then you have mussels, which filter out some of the larger particulate matter, a red algae or kelp that filters the smaller amounts of nitrogen that come into the water. And then finally you have sea cucumbers, which are a big, actually valuable product in Asia along the bottom, that take the big, super large particulate matter like the uneaten feed. So it's still, experimental. But as far as, polyculture, as far as aquaponics is concerned, you're really only dealing about fish and plants. And it can be set up. I've visited a lot of systems that do it. I think the big question is scalability. It's not as simple as just having fish in a barrel, scooping out the poop and dumping it on the plants. It doesn't work that way. There's all these biofilters and things that you have to do. I actually have a garden on my terrace in New York. And I write about it a lot. I call it the ground zero garden. And for years I've wanted to bring fish into the mix. Like people do what's called garbage can tilapia, where they grow the tilapia in a garbage can. I haven't been able to figure it out yet. So, but more younger people than I have certainly figured it out and done it on their own. Another question? Yes.
Where did you get to go for a lot of your research? You mentioned, you lived in Russia, obviously.
Yeah.
But then you had also traveled to other places. Where was most of your research?
So for salmon, I looked at primarily Alaska and Norway, because they're kind of the 2 poles. I've since spent a lot of time in Alaska. I'm actually working on another book right now, which is called The Fish Next Door, which sort of looks at the question of why in a country surrounded by water is 90% of our seafood coming from abroad. I'm still not quite sure why, but I'm working on it. So Alaska and Norway was a big part for that. For sea bass, I spent a lot of time in Greece, because Greece, it turns out, is the sort of birthplace of sea bass farming. Sea bass, there's actually sort of, I call them the twin fish of the aquaculture apocalypse, which is not really apocalypse, but sea bass, and then another fish called a sea bream. It's also called orata that you might see. You might also see it in restaurants as dorade. But these two fish are very, very precious in Greece. Actually, it's an interesting sort of side story was that Greece, right after the military junta ended in the 70s, suddenly wanted to promote tourism. And they had these amazingly cheap packages. You could go to Greece and stay at a cute little pension, and you go to the taverna. And what would you eat? Well, if you're on the Mediterranean, it's like, oh, I will have the fish tonight. And they would always present this beautiful big whole fish to you. And chances are it was usually either a sea bream or a sea bass. That added pressure on the Mediterranean fisheries, which Mediterranean fisheries, the Mediterranean is what's called an oligotrophic sea. It means literally containing little life. One of the reasons the Mediterranean is so pure looking and so clear looking is because most rivers in Europe flow north. They don't bring nutrients into the sea. So there's very little plankton, and hence the levels going up from the plankton are fairly sparse. So suddenly you had this whole group of American and German and French tourists just chowing down on the mega predators, very quickly depleting the supply, which is why aquaculture was born in Greece, to make up for because they realized that these big fish, these big sea bass and sea bream were what fetched top dollar at the taverna. And then, so I tell the story in the sea bass chapter of this guy who's considered the founder of Greek sea bass farming. His name is Thanasis Phrensos, and I sort of liken him to Odysseus because he actually went on a journey to pick up sea bass larvae, and he got hit in a huge storm, and blown off course. And actually what happened is that his sea bass mostly died because the pumps failed in the night of the storm, but about 1,000 of them survived. And it turned out that it was actually a great example of artificial selection, because it turned out to survive in an aquaculture environment, you had to be able to survive periods of low oxygen. And so those were the founders of, sort of like Aeneas going to, the other direction, being the founders of the Roman race. So Greece, and then I went to Vietnam to find out about Pangasius. I went for tuna, mostly I stayed local. I went to North Carolina on a couple of different trips to catch the bluefin migration. But I will say for this, who here would like to write an environmental book at some point? Anybody? Or are we over that at this point? Environmental blog. It's actually tricky because fewer and fewer newspapers and magazines will pay for your travel, and certainly a book advance won't often cover your travel. So it pays to, someday you might get a book advance and you're like, want to book a ticket to the Amazon tomorrow. It's really worth it to spend about a month thinking about what do you actually physically need to see, and what can you actually find on the internet through phone calls and things like that. And it becomes a kind of tapestry, where you weave real life experience together with interviews with, it's funny because many people have reviewed my book and said, and the author's visits to Japan were just amazing, blah, blah. I didn't go to Japan. I found some of the key Japanese experts in the tuna industry and I emailed them, but it gave the impression that I'd been to Japan. So I never said, I'm not misrepresenting myself, but I didn't go to Japan. Anyone else? Yes?
I have to say, when you finished the section on salmon,
yeah.
I thought Alan will never eat salmon again.
Oh, really? Yeah. Well, first of all, the book now, came out in 2010. If a book comes out 1 year, chances are the research on it was concluded a year in advance of the book's finally reaching publication. I've kind of changed my tune a little bit as far as wild Alaska salmon. The salmon that I profiled in the book were a variety of Yukon king salmon, the Yukon king salmon, which is has probably the longest journey of any salmon in the world. The Yukon River is it's like the Mississippi of the Arctic. It goes, all the way from the mouth of the Bering Sea all the way into the interior of Canada. And so the Yukon king because it has to make this really long journey, it has to be extra fatty. It has to reserve all this fat in it. And so it's become this like prized salmon. And so it's gotten a lot of fishing pressure on it. It's also a bycatch product of the pollock industry that I mentioned on the cod chapter. But since then, though, I've become more familiar with sort of more bountiful salmon runs, like Bristol Bay, for example, that I was telling you about, the place where they want to put that huge copper mine. And I've kind of become a big advocate, in particular, of Alaskan sockeye salmon, because the fish is not, generally it's not stock supplemented. They do this crazy thing in Alaska where something like 30% of wild Alaska salmon start in a hatchery. They do this huge hatchery supplementation because they're trying to sort of supercharge the rivers. Sockeye, they generally, in Bristol Bay, they don't supplement them. It's a very valuable resource. It's very well managed. And if we can't maintain the value of that fishery, then what's to stop a huge mining company from coming in? I mean, so the value, the annual value of the Bristol Bay sockeye catch is something around $300 million a year. Pebble Mine is valued at $200 billion. But that value is going to be extracted in like 40 years. If you amortize the value of that salmon over 1,000 years or so, they come out equal, but it's hard to get people to kind of make a 1,000-year in advance plan. By the way, one of the big problems of the Pebble Mine thing is that they want to have, because it's such a huge amount of ore that they want to extract, there's no way to, and there's no roads. They're planning on building a 2,000-foot deep retaining lake where they're literally going to take 5 mountains and build walls around them and just turn it into this huge toxic sludge. It's basically putting a Superfund site in one of the most natural areas in the world. And on top of it, it's a seismic zone. It's an earthquake zone. And these dams are made out of like earth. So it's like, and they're taller than the Statue of Liberty. So like you're going to have this like seismic zone filled with. Oh, and the other thing is that the deposit is only 3% copper. Most of what's in this rock is sulfur. Like if you were to call it by what it really is a sulfur mine. So you're going to get this sulfurous slag that has to be, by EPA standards, maintained in perpetuity, forever. Like if you think Anglo-American and Northern Dynasty will maintain their site forever, I think that's very wishful thinking. So, but yeah. So in other words, I would eat Alaska sockeye salmon, and I'm actually in this very funny debate right now. There's a publication called Yale Environment 360, which is kind of, if any of you thinking about writing about the environment, it's kind of not a bad place to submit. But I challenged the head of Aqua Bounty to a debate on whether or not we should have genetically modified salmon. And actually I've become friendly with him since. Like, I was thinking of him as like the Antichrist for the longest time. Turns out he's a nice guy from Boston. He just had this idea. And it's like all these things that people you think are so inherently evil. Well, if they are evil, it's very passively presented. So I've been having this long discussion about, about the Aqua Bounty salmon. And, he says, his main point is, one of the big problems with salmon farming is that you tend to farm salmon where salmon live. The Aqua Bounty salmon, because it grows so fast, you can grow it in a tank. Now, growing fish in a tank is very, very energy expensive, right? Because you have to heat the water, you have to circulate the water. So if you're going to use a tank, you've got to make the fish grow really fast to make that system work efficiently. And so the Aqua Bounty guy's argument is, well, geez, I just want to grow a bunch of fish in tanks and not hurt the environment. And so what if it's genetically modified? They're all staying in tanks. They're not going to get out into the wild anyway. There are long. I'll email Susan the article when it comes out. You can distribute it. But there are many arguments pro and con. But all things are open for debate. Now, one of the things when Jackie and I both studied this semiotics program at Brown, and I think you guys probably have similar things at Bard, right? Like similar kind of thing. But when I wrote this book, the semiotics, there's this idea of the open text, where in a way. You're going to have to nail me on this one, but kind of that the author is almost not there, that it's like this text that you can enter or exit at your will, and it's like a field of your own imagination. And while I was a terrible semiotician, I did kind of passively believe in the idea of the open text. And when I wrote this book, I realized that a lot of people had written books against aquaculture. A lot of people had written books against fishing, all kinds of treatises. And what I wanted to do was just kind of write an open text. Like, here's what the industry does. And you kind of make the judgment. But what's interesting is, for me, is in my life, as an author and as a lecturer, I get hired to lecture to any weird groups of people. Like, I got this weird conglomerate hedge fund called me up and asked me to lecture to their board of directors. And they asked me out to lunch first. They said, Paul, we really want you to come talk because we're thinking about getting heavily involved in the protein space. And I was like, the protein space, what's that? And he's like, well, food. Like, so, and it's aquaculture. And they were like, and we just love the positivist view you took on aquaculture, and we just think that it's really great. And I'm like, okay, I'll talk about the protein space. And then, somebody else will be like, from like the Alaska salmon people, be like, can you come down to Washington and talk about how important wild salmon is and, how aquaculture is destroying it? And I'm like, I'll talk about what I wrote, And so, I ended up like, in the Supreme Court, like in the lobby, in the lawyers building the Supreme Court, talking about Alaska salmon and how great they are, and I think they are great. So it's just, it's strange. I wanted this book to be something that anyone could come to, and I realized that if I made it into a straight-out diatribe, that probably I would exclude a lot of people from it. And I think the strategy paid off. I mean, it was it sold well. It's been translated into a bunch of languages, including Japan. We just found out. So, I think, as a young person, you're often compelled to want to be sort of a firebrand and have this like angry point of view, this like direct point of view. And there's definitely strength in that. And if you've come to a point where you've solidly proved that your conviction is right, then it's good. But it's also good occasionally to drop your guard and talk to the other side with an open mind and just see what they're saying. If nothing else, then to sharpen your arguments against them. Because otherwise you're just like a blunt instrument moving through space, not really convincing anyone, and just almost like a wedge driving things apart. So, yes?
I just want to, could you talk more about dams?
Yeah.
How much they suck? Just a question. When you said that the salmon runs, specifically in Connecticut, just disappeared,
Yep.
Were you saying they became like completely locally extinct, or maybe they just got reduced to the point?
Salmon in Connecticut are extinct.
Okay.
They're actually extinct as of this year because since the 60s they had been trying to do a salmon restoration program on the Connecticut and also I think another river in maybe the Housatonic, but I think they still have some hatcheries going where they dump some landlocked Atlantic salmon into different lakes around Connecticut, but basically they're extinct in Connecticut. Elsewhere, they're not extinct in Norway, they're not extinct in Canada, they're not extinct in they have an endangered species listing in Maine. And yes, dams do, I'm not allowed to use the word that you used, but are not so great. We're actually in this interesting turnover point with dams right now because a lot of these dams are failing just naturally. Some of them are hydro dams that produce power. Some of them are just useless. But when you have something like Hurricane Sandy and Hurricane Irene, I remember I actually wrote a piece for The Atlantic a few years ago about how if we ever were to get a major hurricane in the Northeast, we would have a colossal failure of dams and it would cause wide-scale damage. And my editor at the time said, "A hurricane in the Northeast? What are you talking about?" Since then we've had two. So it is, I think, in the public interest to remove dams. And there are, I actually think, for you guys coming out of college, if anyone's considering an engineering degree or looking at engineering, I think dam removal might actually be a growth industry. It might be one of the few growth industries out there. Because, again, these dams are failing. There's a cost involved in maintaining them. So you have industry that actually would maybe pay for their removal. And you have a public will issue wanting these things removed. And when you talk about removing dams, you're not just talking about salmon revival. There's all these other things, like they're right now contemplating an environmental species, Endangered Species Act listing for river herring. Like river herring were once as bountiful as passenger pigeons, and they fed all these fish. But river herring require a river to spawn, right? So it's not charismatic megafauna, but all these little dams block the passage of river herring. So I firmly believe that if you were to remove a lot of these dams in the Northeast, we've kind of hit, so since 1996, there was something passed called the Sustainable Fisheries Act, which demanded that all American fish species needed to be rebuilt right about now. And we've actually achieved quite a bit of success, and a lot of species have been rebuilt to a point, but they were very low benchmarks set for the rebuilding. Some fish we can't seem to rebuild, but whatever the case is, I think that we could go this much further if we got rid of these dams, because we would be infusing the ocean with this biological energy that now is being impeded by all these dams. So, down with the dams. Get yourself a nice engineering degree. Listen to your mother. I think it's a really noble thing. If you spent your whole life knocking down dams, Dayenu, that would be great. So. Yeah, so just going to say, if you guys want to stay in touch, that's all my contact information. And I only check Facebook like 30 to 40 times a day, so it might be a little while coming back to me. And Twitter's the same. But feel free to contact me, and even if you have questions about, if you want to do a research topic on fish and stuff, I'm happy to direct you to resources. So anyway, thank you for your time.